There's a particular kind of quiet that settles on a porch in southern Ohio when the leaves start turning. It isn't the quiet of an empty house. It's older than that. It's the quiet that comes after a man has lived enough years to stop expecting much from the wind and just lets it come. I was sitting in that quiet on a Thursday afternoon in mid-October, in the same wooden chair I'd had since before my wife Margaret passed. The chair creaks now when I sit down, and it creaks again when I stand up, and somewhere in between. It's where most of my thinking gets done these days. My coffee had gone cold in the thermos beside me. I hadn't noticed. I was holding a birthday card in my hand, and I had been holding it for about 30 minutes without opening the envelope. The envelope was pale blue, with my name written across the front in my daughter's handwriting. Rachel, my oldest. 41 years old now, though I still see her sometimes the way I saw her at 6, sitting on the steps of our old porch in a yellow dress, waiting for me to pull the rig in from a 3-week run. The card was for my grandson Eli's birthday. He was turning 10 that weekend up in Columbus, and Rachel had mailed the invitation herself, which surprised me. Usually it was her assistant who sent things like that. There'd be a printed card with my name spelled correctly, but written by a stranger, and a line at the bottom that said, "Looking forward to seeing you," in a tone that didn't sound like Rachel at all. This one was handwritten. That was the part that had me sitting still. I opened it eventually. Just 2 lines. "Dad, Eli's party is Saturday at 4. He's been asking about you. Hope you can make it. Rachel." I read it twice. Then I folded it back into the envelope and set it on the little side table next to my coffee. And I watched a cardinal land on the railing for a second before he thought better of it and flew off. I'd be 62 in February. I'd been retired from driving for about 2 years. 34 years on the road before that long haul. Mostly. Cleveland to Denver, Indianapolis to Salt Lake. Some nights I covered more miles than a man ought to, in weather that nobody should be out in, for a paycheck that always seemed smaller than the hours I'd put into earning it. I did it because that was the job, and the job was how you kept a roof over your family's head, and the roof was the point. My wife Margaret used to say, I was the kind of man who'd rather pay the electric bill than turn on the lights. She wasn't entirely wrong about that. We'd been married 38 years when the cancer took her. 5 years ago this November. I still hadn't gotten used to coming home to a house where nobody was waiting up. I probably never would. So when Rachel's card sat there on the side table, I wasn't sure how to read it. He's been asking about you. That was the line that did something to me. Because I knew Eli had been asking. He was the one grandchild who still climbed up in my lap when I came over, who wanted to hear about the trucks, who asked me real questions and listened to the answers. His older sister had stopped looking up from her phone 2 birthdays ago, and that was fine. That was just what the age does. But Eli was different. What I wasn't sure about was whether Rachel actually wanted me there, or whether she was just being polite to her son. That's a strange thing to write down, isn't it? A man wondering if his own daughter wants him at her boy's birthday. But that's the truth of where we were. And I'm not going to dress it up. There'd been distance between Rachel and me for a long time. Not the kind of distance that comes from a fight, the kind that comes from a slow drift, year after year, while I was out on the road earning the money that put her through Ohio State, and she was at home becoming a woman I didn't quite know how to talk to anymore. Rachel works in marketing for a big firm in Columbus now. She married a man named Marcus who wears watches that cost more than my first truck. They have a beautiful house in a development with a name that sounds like a country club. 2 kids, Eli, and his older sister Madison, who's 13 and prefers to be called Maddie. From the outside, Rachel's life looks like the kind of life a father is supposed to be proud of. And I am proud of it. I want to say that right at the start, because what comes later in this story might make a person think otherwise. I'm proud of my daughter. I always have been. I've just never been entirely sure she was proud of me back. I sat on that porch until the sun went down behind the maple at the end of the drive. Then I went inside, hung my brown work jacket on the same hook by the door I'd been hanging it on since 1986, and I called my daughter to tell her I'd be there Saturday. She sounded surprised. That was the part that stayed with me. She actually sounded surprised that I said yes. I should have heard something in that. A man with better ears for trouble would have. But I just said I'd see her Saturday, and I hung up the phone. And I went and stood for a long time in front of the locked drawer in my bedroom, the one Margaret used to call my quiet drawer, and I didn't open it that night. I didn't know yet that what I'd held back in that drawer for 30 years was about to start asking to come out into the light. Saturday came on cold for October. The kind of cold that makes you check the truck's antifreeze before you turn the key, just out of habit, even though you know you topped it off last month. I'd been doing that check for 40 years. Some habits don't leave a man just because he stops needing them. I'd put on my good shirt, the blue button-down Margaret bought me the Christmas before she got sick. It still smelled faintly of the cedar block in my dresser. I'd shaved twice that morning because I'd nicked myself the first time, and I didn't want to walk into Rachel's house with a piece of tissue stuck to my chin. I put on the brown work jacket because it was the warmest thing I owned. Margaret had patched the right elbow herself, back in 2011, and I'd never had the heart to replace it. The drive from my place outside Marietta up to Columbus is about 3 hours if the weather behaves. I took the back roads as long as I could before merging onto Interstate 70. I'd driven that stretch of 70 1,000 times in my working years. There's a part of you that never stops noticing it. The mile markers. The exits where the good diners used to be. The rest stop near Cambridge where I once sat through a blizzard for 14 hours in 1989, listening to Hank Williams on a cassette while my rig idled outside. I thought about that blizzard while I drove. I don't know why it came to mind that morning. Maybe because I was on my way to see Rachel, and Rachel had been 4 years old that winter, back home with Margaret in the little house on Vine Street. I'd been trying to get home for her birthday. I missed it by 2 days. When I finally pulled in, she wouldn't come out of her room. Margaret had to coax her down the stairs with a piece of birthday cake, and Rachel ate it sitting on the bottom step, not looking at me. I remember thinking, she'll forget this. Kids forget. I don't think she ever forgot. Actually, I think she just learned, that winter, that her daddy was the kind of man who came home late. And once a child learns a thing like that about her father, she carries it with her into every room she walks into for the rest of her life, even if she never says so. I got off 70 at the Reynoldsburg exit and worked my way through the suburbs. Rachel and Marcus live in one of those developments where every house has a stone facade across the front and shutters that don't actually close. The lawns are cut at angles. There's a fountain at the entrance with a sign that says the name of the subdivision in gold letters. I always feel about half a foot shorter when I drive through that gate. Not because anyone there has ever said a word to me, just because the place itself doesn't seem to have been built with men like me in mind. I pulled into the driveway behind Marcus's BMW and Rachel's Lexus. My old Chevy pickup looked exactly as out of place as I felt. I sat there for a minute with the engine off, watching the leaves blow across their perfect lawn. Then I picked up the wrapped gift on the passenger seat, a model truck for Eli, a Peterbilt 389. The same model I'd driven for the last 11 years of my career, and I went up the front walk. Rachel opened the door before I rang the bell. She must have been watching for me. "Dad," she said. She gave me a quick hug, the kind that ends before it really starts. "Come in. They're in the back." She looked tired. That's the first thing I noticed. Underneath the makeup, she had those dark patches under her eyes that women get when they haven't been sleeping. Her hair was pulled back in a way that looked careful from a distance and not careful at all up close. She was thinner than the last time I'd seen her at the 4th of July. I didn't say anything about it. A father learns when to keep his observations to himself. The house smelled like a candle that was trying too hard to smell like apples. There were balloons in the foyer, and a banner over the dining room arch that said "Happy Birthday, Eli" in letters that had been professionally cut from cardstock. Through the back windows, I could see a bounce house set up on the lawn, and maybe 15 kids running around in coats over their party clothes, and a small clutch of adults standing by the patio with wine glasses. "Eli's outside," Rachel said. "He's been asking when you'd get here every 10 minutes since noon." She said it lightly, the way people say things they don't quite mean to land. But it landed on me anyway. I just nodded and made my way through the kitchen toward the back door. That was when Eli saw me through the glass. He was wearing a dinosaur sweater that was 2 sizes too big for him, and the second he caught sight of his grandpa, his whole face changed. He came barreling across the patio at a full run, and he hit me at the back door hard enough that I almost dropped the gift. "Grandpa." That was all he said, just that one word. And then his arms were around my middle, and his face was pressed into my jacket. And he stayed like that for longer than a 10-year-old usually does. I put my hand on the back of his head and let him stay. I didn't see Rachel watching us from the kitchen. I only found that out later. But she was watching, and something about that scene, her boy holding on to his grandfather, like he was the only solid thing in the room, must have stirred something in her that she hadn't been ready to feel. Because everything that happened at dinner that night, everything she said and didn't say, started with that hug at the back door, even if neither of us understood it yet. The party went the way kids' parties go. There was a lot of running, a lot of shrieking, and a cake shaped like a dinosaur that someone had paid a great deal of money for. Eli blew out his candles in one breath, which everyone applauded for like he'd performed a miracle, and then the kids tore the wrapping off the gifts in the way that always made me feel like I should have spent less time choosing the paper. When Eli got to my gift, he went still. He pulled the Peterbilt out of the box slowly, holding it with both hands, and he looked up at me across the room with an expression I'd remember for a long time afterward. "It's the same one you used to drive," he said. "That's right, son. The very same model. It even has the lights." "It does. The headlights work and the trailer lights work. Batteries are in the back." He didn't say thanks right away. He just turned the truck over in his hands and examined the underside, like he wanted to understand how it was put together. That's the kind of kid he is. The other gifts had been louder. There was a video game console from Marcus's parents, and a tablet from somebody, and a remote control car that was already buzzing across the dining room floor. My truck didn't make any sound at all unless you flipped the headlights on. But Eli set the truck on the coffee table the way a man sets down something he intends to keep. And then he came over and hugged me again. Marcus's mother was watching from across the room. She's a polite woman, lives in Upper Arlington, drives a Mercedes. She gave me a smile that didn't quite include her eyes and said, "That's such a thoughtful gift, David. He'll treasure it." I knew what she meant. She meant it was a cheap gift compared to the others. She didn't mean any harm by it. People who've never had to count quarters out of a glass jar at the kitchen table at the end of the month don't always know how words like thoughtful sound on the receiving end. I just nodded and said, "I hope so." The party started thinning out around 6. The kids went home with their goodie bags, and the adults started gathering in the kitchen the way adults do refilling wine, eating the cake the kids hadn't touched, talking about things kids weren't supposed to hear. Rachel had ordered pizza for the adults, and somebody had put on jazz music that was too quiet to enjoy and too loud to ignore. I sat at the kitchen island on one of those high stools that was never made for a man with a bad knee. Marcus was holding court at the other end of the counter, telling a story about a colleague's vacation home in Aspen. His parents were laughing. Rachel was laughing too. But it was the laugh she does when she's not really listening, when her face is doing the work, but her mind is somewhere else. I noticed her glance down at her phone twice while Marcus was talking. The second time, whatever she saw made her jaw tighten for half a second before she put the phone face down on the counter. I noticed because I've spent a lifetime watching people through windshields and rear-view mirrors and the reflections in diner glass. You learn faces. You learn what they do when they think nobody's looking. Eli came in from the living room and tugged on my sleeve. "Grandpa, can I show you my room?" "You sure can." He led me upstairs, past a wall of framed family photographs that I hadn't been in since 2016. His room was at the end of the hall. Blue walls. A bed shaped like a race car that he was probably already too old for but hadn't asked to replace. Books stacked on the nightstand. He went straight to a shelf above his desk and showed me the lineup of trucks I'd given him over the years, 6 of them now, including the new Peterbilt. 3 little Mack trucks. A Kenworth. A flatbed I'd given him when he was 4. He'd kept every one. "Mom says I have too many," he said. "But I told her these ones are different." "How are they different?" He thought about that. He didn't answer right away. Then he said, "Because you gave them to me, and you drove the real ones." I had to look at the wall for a second to keep my face right. That's the thing about grandsons. They say what they mean. They haven't learned yet that you're supposed to dress your love up in something more sophisticated. He just looked at his shelf and said the truth out loud. The way you'd say what color the sky was. We sat on his bed for a few minutes, and he told me about school, and about a kid named Brody who'd been mean to him at recess, and about how he wanted to learn to drive someday not a car, a real truck. I told him driving a truck wasn't all that glamorous. He said he didn't care. I told him about the Wyoming sky in February, how the stars looked from a cab parked at a rest stop after midnight, and he listened the way kids listen when nobody's tried to teach them anything in particular, and they're just learning because they want to. I could have stayed up there in that room all night. I think Eli could have too. But Rachel called us down for dinner around 6:30, and we went. That's the moment. Looking back, that I'd hold on to if I could. Not the dinner that came after. The minutes upstairs in that room, with my grandson sitting beside me on a race car bed, telling me which truck was his favorite and why. Because what happened at the dinner table changed something between Rachel and me, something that took a long time to find its way back. And I've thought, more than once, that if I'd known what was coming, I might have stayed up in that bedroom a little longer, just to keep the evening from turning. But a man doesn't get to know those things in advance. He just gets to live them, and then sit on a porch later and try to make sense of why. Rachel had set the dining room table for 8. Cloth napkins. The good plates from the cabinet she only opened on holidays. There were little place cards in front of each setting, written in her handwriting, and I noticed she'd put me at the far end, across from Eli, with Marcus's parents between us. I don't think she did it on purpose. I think she just hadn't thought too hard about it. But there's a kind of seating arrangement that tells a man where he stands in a room without anybody having to say a word. And I'd been reading those arrangements since I was old enough to sit at a table. I sat down where my card said, Marcus came in with a bottle of wine he kept describing as if the bottle itself were a person we should all be impressed to meet. He poured glasses for everyone, including a small one for Maddie, who'd come downstairs at last and was scrolling on her phone with her elbow on the table. Marcus skipped my glass. I'd told him years ago I didn't drink, and to his credit, he'd remembered. He poured me water from the pitcher instead, and I thanked him. The conversation started in the usual places. The weather, somebody's golf game, Maddie's volleyball team. Marcus's mother told a long story about a friend of hers who was redoing her kitchen in something called quartzite. And I just nodded along. Because what else does a man do at a table where the conversation has nothing to do with him? Eli was looking at me from across the table. Every so often he'd catch my eye and grin, like the two of us were sharing a private joke nobody else was in on. I'd grin back, and it would be enough to carry me through another 5 minutes of quartzite. Then somebody, I think it was Marcus's father, asked Rachel about a woman from her old college class who'd been featured in a business magazine that month. Rachel knew the woman. They'd been in some kind of program together at Ohio State. The woman had started a marketing agency that had just been acquired for what Marcus's father called a number with a lot of zeros. Rachel laughed, but it wasn't a real laugh. She said something about how she'd seen the article and how proud she was. Then she took a long drink of her wine and said, half to herself, "Some people just have the right parents, I guess." Her dad sat on the board of 3 companies before she ever opened her laptop. Marcus's mother made a sympathetic sound. Connections matter, sweetheart. There's no shame in that. We did everything we could for Marcus. You did, Rachel said. And then, without looking at me, she added, some of us figured it out on our own. I felt that, the way you feel a stone go through a window. Not loud, just sudden. I kept my eyes on my plate. I cut a piece of chicken I didn't really want to eat. Eli was watching me again, but this time he wasn't grinning. He'd picked up that something had shifted at the table, even if he couldn't have named it. Kids feel weather changes before the grown-ups admit there's a storm. The conversation drifted a little. Marcus tried to pivot to football. Marcus's father played along, but Rachel had another glass of wine in her hand by then, and she wasn't done. I could see it in her shoulders. There was something sitting on her chest, and the wine had loosened it just enough to start working its way up. You know what I was thinking the other day, she said. She wasn't talking to anyone in particular. She was looking at the centerpiece, a glass bowl of small orange pumpkins she'd probably bought at Whole Foods. I was thinking about how some kids grow up with these dads who were, you know, somebody who showed up to school events, who could explain their job at career day, who took them to museums. Marcus's mother said, "Oh, honey," very gently. "I'm not saying anything bad. I'm just saying, it's interesting, isn't it? How different lives shake out." I set down my fork. I think I was still hoping she'd stop on her own. She didn't. She turned her head, and she looked at me at last, down the length of that pretty table, with her eyes a little too bright from the wine and a little too tired from whatever was going on in her real life that nobody at this table knew about. And she said the sentence I have not been able to put down since. My dad was a failed father. He was a man who only knew how to stare at a steering wheel. That's the truth of it. He gave us money and he gave us absence, and he never once gave us anything to be proud of. The kitchen got very quiet. The jazz was still playing in the living room. Marcus put his wine glass down without making a sound. His mother's mouth had opened a little, and she closed it again. Maddie looked up from her phone for the first time all evening. Eli was staring at his mother with the kind of stillness that children only do when they've never seen the grown-ups behave that way before. I looked at Rachel for a long second. She didn't look away, but she didn't look proud of herself either. Whatever had pushed those words out of her mouth, it wasn't satisfaction. It was something more complicated than that. Something I didn't fully understand right then. Sitting at the end of her dinner table in a shirt my wife had bought me. I folded my napkin. I set it next to my plate, lined up neat, the way I'd been taught when I was a boy. I took a small sip of water. My hand was steady. I made sure of that. I think I'd better head back, I said. Weather's coming in over the river tonight. I don't want to be on 70 past 9. Marcus's mother started to say something. Marcus said, "Dave, come on now," and started to stand up. I held up a hand, very gently, the way you'd ask a friend not to walk into the road. "It's a long drive," I said. "I should get on it." I went around the table to Eli. He stood up before I got there, and I bent down, my knee crackled, the way it does, and I hugged him. I told him happy birthday. I told him I'd love to have him out to the river before the snow came. He nodded against my shoulder, and I felt him press himself a little harder into my jacket, and I had to take a breath before I let him go. I didn't speak to Rachel on my way out. I didn't trust what would come out of my mouth, and I have always believed that the words a man can't take back are worse than the words he never said. I just nodded at the room in general, picked up the brown jacket I'd hung over the dining chair, and walked out the front door into the October cold. I sat in my truck for a minute before I started it. The lights from Rachel's living room threw a warm rectangle out across the lawn. Inside the rectangle, I could see her standing by the table, one hand to her mouth, the other braced flat on the back of a chair. She wasn't crying. She was just standing there, like she'd just looked down and realized the ground was a long way below her. I turned the key. The old Chevy started on the first try, the way she always did. I backed out slow, and I drove out through the gate with the gold letters, and I pointed the truck south toward home. That word failed sat in the cab with me like a passenger. 3 hours, all the way down 70. It didn't say anything. It didn't have to. It just rode along. And every time I thought I'd shaken it loose at a mile marker, I'd find it again at the next one. I'd been called a lot of things over the years, by dispatchers, by way station officers, by drivers who didn't like the way I'd taken a curve. None of those had ever stuck. They came off like rain off a windshield. But this one had been said by my own girl, in front of my grandson, at the end of a table I had paid for, in a house that stood on a foundation I had helped pour with 34 years of nights I'd spent away from her. I drove home in the dark, and I didn't turn the radio on, and somewhere around the Cambridge exit I realized I was gripping the wheel hard enough that my knuckles had gone white. I made myself loosen them. A man who grips the wheel too hard loses his feel for the road. Margaret used to tell me that. Loose hands. David. Loose hands and a clear eye. I made it home a little before 9. I sat in the gravel drive for a while with the engine ticking down. The porch light I'd left on was waiting for me. The thermos was where I'd left it on the side table. I went inside. I hung the brown jacket on its hook, and I walked back to my bedroom, and I knelt down by the bottom drawer of my dresser, and for the first time in a long time, I put the small brass key into the lock and turned it. Inside were the things I had kept there for 30 years. Envelopes, bound with rubber bands. 2 leather ledger books. The spines cracked from age. A small stack of bank statements. The most recent on top. And on top of all of it, in its own slim manila folder, a single folded letter in my wife's handwriting, written from a hospital bed in November of 2020. I didn't read the letter that night. I just touched the edge of it, the way a man touches a thing he's promised to keep. And I closed the drawer again, and I locked it. I had a feeling, sitting back on my heels in the lamplight, that I was going to have to open it again soon, and that the next time I did, I wouldn't be closing it the same way. The first frost came down on the river the night after Eli's party. I woke up to it on Sunday morning, the lawn silver and stiff, and the maple at the end of the drive had let go of about half its leaves overnight. That's how October ends out here. It doesn't argue with you. It just decides. I made coffee the way I always do. Black, in the same enamel pot I'd had since the late 90s. I ate 2 pieces of toast standing at the counter, the way Margaret used to fuss at me about. Sit down at the table, David. We have a table for a reason. I'd grin at her and she'd shake her head. And then I'd sit. After she was gone, the standing came back. A man falls into his old shapes when nobody's looking. I didn't think much about Friday's drive home that morning. Or I should say, I thought about it the way a man thinks about a bruise. You don't poke at it. You just know it's there. What I did think about was the 5th of November. That was the date that mattered. The 5th of every month, for 30 years, on or as close to the 5th as the mail allowed. I had walked down to the little brick post office on Main Street in our town and handed Doris Whitley a padded envelope. Inside was a money order, made out to a community bank in Cincinnati. Sometimes it was for $200, sometimes for $500. In the lean years, when the truck needed a transmission, it might have been $50, but there was always an envelope. There had been one every month since November of 1995, and I had never missed the fifth. Doris had taken over the post office from her father in the late 80s. She'd seen me come in with that envelope every month since she was a young woman, and she'd watched her own hair go white behind that counter, and she had never once asked me what was in it. That's the kind of woman Doris is. There are people in this country who still understand that some things aren't theirs to know. That Sunday, the 5th of November, fell on the following Tuesday. I had 2 days to get the envelope ready. I sat down at the kitchen table with my checkbook and my little ledger and a pen, and I did the same arithmetic I'd done 600 times before. The lawn finished thawing while I worked. A breeze came up off the river. I could hear the old furnace in the basement kick on. The house was quiet, but it was a different kind of quiet than the porch had been on Thursday. That porch quiet had been waiting. This kitchen quiet was working. When I was done, I sealed the envelope, wrote the address in block letters, and set it on the corner of the counter where I'd see it on my way out Tuesday morning. Same as always. Then I went and got the brown jacket and walked down to the river. I do that most Sundays. There's a path that runs along the bank for about a mile, between 2 stands of sycamores, and I walk it until I get to a bench somebody put up in memory of a man I never met. I sit on that bench and I watch the Ohio for a while. The river doesn't ask anything of you. It just keeps going. There's a comfort in that. When you reach a certain age, you start to want company that doesn't need anything from you. I sat on that bench Sunday morning and I thought about Rachel. I want to tell you something honest. I wasn't angry at her. I know how that sounds, after what she'd said at her own dinner table. A man's supposed to be angry. A man's supposed to thump the steering wheel and say how dare she and write a long letter he'll never send and feel righteous about himself for a few weeks. I wasn't any of that. I was sad. There's a difference, and the difference matters. Anger is a fire. Sadness is more like fog. It doesn't burn. It just settles, and it makes it hard to see what's in front of you. And you have to drive slower until it lifts. I was sad because I'd heard, in Rachel's voice on Friday night, the voice of a 4-year-old who'd waited 2 days past her birthday for her father to come home from a Wyoming blizzard. I'd heard the voice of a 9-year-old who'd had to explain to her teacher why her dad couldn't come to the school play. I'd heard the voice of a teenager whose friends' fathers all came home for dinner at 6, and all those voices had been crammed inside a 41-year-old woman in a beautiful dining room, and they had come out the wrong way, in front of the wrong people, on the wrong night. She wasn't wrong about the absence. I had been absent. I'd been absent for the things you can't get back. What she didn't know, what I had never told her, because Margaret and I had decided it was better that way, was what the absence had paid for. I sat on that bench and I watched a barge come down the river, low in the water, hauling coal probably, and I thought about the 5th of November in 1995, when this whole quiet business of mine began. Margaret had been 36 that year. I was 32. We'd been married 8 years. Rachel was a skinny 10-year-old who already wore glasses, and her little sister Hannah was 7, with a missing front tooth and a habit of laughing at her own jokes before she'd finished telling them. I'd been driving long haul for about 4 years by then. Before that, I'd been the assistant manager at a tire and lube outfit just outside Marietta. The pay was steady, but it wasn't enough. We were still renting then, a little 2-bedroom on Vine Street, and Margaret had been picking up extra shifts as a nurse at the hospital just to keep us even. She'd come home at 3 in the morning sometimes, and I'd hear her trying not to wake the girls, and I'd lie there in the dark and feel like I was failing my family in a way I couldn't put a name to. So in the spring of '91, when a man I went to high school with told me his company was hiring drivers and the starting pay was almost double what I was making at the lube shop, I sat Margaret down at our kitchen table and asked her what she thought. She didn't say yes right away. That was her way. She held the question in her hands for a few days, like she was weighing it, and then she came to me on a Sunday evening with her decision. "You take it," she said, "but understand what it'll cost. The girls won't grow up knowing you the way they would if you stayed, and one day they may hold it against you. You have to be ready for that. David, both of us do." I told her I was ready. I don't think I really was. A man at 32 doesn't know yet what it means to be missed by his own children. He just knows that the mortgage is due on the 15th, and that double the pay sounds like the answer to a prayer. I took the job. I drove for 4 years before the conversation came that changed everything. 4 years of leaving on Sundays and coming home Friday afternoons if I was lucky. Sometimes Saturday morning. Sometimes Monday before dawn. 4 years of watching Rachel grow up in the space between trips. 4 years of feeling, every time I pulled into our little driveway, like I was trying to step back into a life that had kept moving without me. And then came November of 1995, the night Margaret sat me down at our kitchen table again and made me an offer that I have spent every month since trying to live up to. I'd come in from a 5-day run that night. I remember it was raining when I pulled into the driveway. The cold kind of November rain that doesn't make any noise but soaks you to the skin in under a minute. I came through the back door, and Margaret was in her bathrobe at the kitchen table, with a little brass desk lamp turned on, and a stack of bills in front of her, and a coffee mug at her elbow that I could tell from across the room had gone cold hours ago. The girls were asleep. The house had that particular hush that comes after children have been put down and the dishwasher has finished its cycle. I hung my jacket on the chair. I went to her, and I kissed the top of her head. Her hair smelled like the lavender soap she'd been using since we got married, and I sat down across from her without saying anything. She looked up at me. She had the kind of face that didn't show worry unless you knew her. To anybody else, she'd just have looked tired. To me, she looked frightened. "What is it, Maggie?" She tapped the bill on top of the stack. "Hannah needs braces. Dr. Whitaker says we ought to start in the spring. He said we could spread it over 2 years, but it's still close to 4,000. "Okay." And the roof's been leaking again over the back porch. Pete came by Wednesday. He said it's not the patch, it's the whole back slope. He said we can get one more winter out of it if we're careful. "All right." She lifted another paper, and I had Mrs. Hendricks read the letter from the bank. "Our interest rate is going up next year on the variable. They sent us the notice." I nodded. I waited. She set the papers down then, and she folded her hands on top of them, and she looked at me the way she did when she'd already made up her mind about something and was about to walk me through it. "David, I've been thinking about what happens if you can't drive anymore." That stopped me. I started to say something, and she held up her hand. "I'm not saying you can't. I'm saying what if? You came home Tuesday with that cough that wouldn't quit, and last month the doctor said your blood pressure was high, and I just..." I lay awake on Wednesday night thinking about what we'd do if one day you came home and said, "Maggie, I can't go back out there." And the answer I came up with was, we'd lose this house inside 6 months. I didn't argue with her. She was right. We were a paycheck-to-paycheck family with a mortgage that ate 40% of our income. We had no savings to speak of. Whatever I made on the road went straight into the running of the house, and what didn't get spent on the house got spent on the girls. "So I have an idea," she said, "and I want you to hear me out before you say anything." "Go on." "I want us to open an account, not at our bank, somewhere else. Somewhere far enough away that the girls won't ever stumble across a statement when they're poking around looking for the Christmas presents." I was thinking Cincinnati. I have a cousin who works at a little community bank down there. She could set us up. And we'd put what in it? Whatever you can spare. Some months it'll be $20. Some months it might be $500. I'm not asking for a number. I'm asking for a habit. Every month, on the same day, we treat it like the electric bill. It comes out before we even see it. I sat back in my chair. "Maggie, we can't spare anything. You just showed me the bills. I know what I showed you, and I'm telling you we can, not much, but something. Because if we don't start now, David, we'll be 60 and we'll have nothing put by. And the girls will grow up and they'll need things we can't give them. And I am not going to sit at this table when I'm 60 years old and tell my daughters I can't help them, because I never figured out how to save $1. She was crying then, but she wasn't letting herself cry. Her eyes were full, but her voice was steady. That was Margaret. She could carry a feeling for an hour without letting it spill. I reached across the table and I took her hands. They were cold. They were always cold in November. "Tell me what you're afraid of, Maggie. The real thing." She was quiet for a long time. The rain was still coming down. I could hear it on the kitchen window. "I'm afraid that one day one of our girls is going to be in trouble," she said. "And she's going to be too proud or too scared to ask anybody for help. And by the time we find out, it'll be too late. I want there to be something. I want there to be a quiet thing, a thing we built without telling them, so that when that day comes, we can just be there, without making them ask." I sat with that for a minute. I'd been on the road for 4 years by then. I'd seen a lot of country and a lot of weather, and I'd thought I'd grown some kind of practical wisdom out there in the cab. But I want to tell you, sitting at that kitchen table on the 5th of November in 1995, listening to my wife describe a thing she'd been quietly turning over in her mind for months, that was the moment I understood what kind of woman I had married. Not the day we said our vows, not the days the girls were born. That night, in her bathrobe, with cold coffee at her elbow, holding my hands and telling me what she was afraid of, I said, "All right, Maggie, we'll do it your way." "Are you sure?" "I'm sure. We'll start small. We'll be patient. And we won't tell the girls." Not a word. Not to them. Not to your brother. Not to anybody. "Not a word." She squeezed my hands. Then she got up and made me a fresh cup of coffee and a fried egg sandwich. Because that's what Margaret did when an important conversation ended. She fed you. The next week, She called her cousin in Cincinnati, and we opened the account. I remember the first deposit was $42.16. I remember because I wrote it in the back of an old spiral notebook that night, and that notebook eventually became one of the leather ledgers in the drawer. $42.16. That was where it started. I'd love to tell you that we were disciplined about it from day one. We weren't exactly. The first year, there were months I only managed $20. There were months I had to skip and double up the next time. But Margaret had been right about the habit. Once we'd started, neither of us could bear to stop. It became a thing between us, a little secret accomplishment we kept at the corner of our marriage, away from where the children could see. By 1998, I was putting in $200 most months. By 2002, $300. By the time the girls were both in college, I was averaging $400 a month, and I was running every overtime route I could get my hands on to keep that number going up. I never touched a dollar of it, not for a vacation, not for a new truck, not when my mother got sick in '05, not when our furnace died in the middle of January in '09 and we ran space heaters for 2 weeks because I refused to dip into the account to fix it. Margaret backed me on every one of those decisions. She never wavered. Not once. Our girls grew up thinking we were paycheck to paycheck people, and we were, in a sense. The house we lived in showed our income. The car we drove showed our income. The vacations we took, which were mostly trips to my brother's farm in Kentucky, showed our income. What didn't show was Cincinnati. What didn't show was the quiet thing we were building, month by month, on a kitchen table where the rain had once come down on the window like the world was trying to tell us to stop. We didn't stop. That was the whole point. We didn't stop. I have to tell you about Hannah now. I've been putting it off because it's a hard part to tell, but you can't understand the rest of what happened without it, and you can't understand me without it either. Hannah was our younger girl. She was 7 when Margaret and I opened the Cincinnati account, and she had a way of laughing that made other people start laughing before they knew what was funny. She was the kind of child who would come up to a stranger in a grocery store and ask them about their dog. She read books 2 grades above her level. She wanted to be a veterinarian for about 3 years, and then a marine biologist for about 2, and then a forest ranger from the time she was 13 until the day she died. She died on a Saturday morning in April of 2006. She was 20 years old. She was a sophomore at Hocking College, studying natural resources, and she was driving back from a weekend visit home when a man in a pickup ran a stop sign on a county road outside Logan. The state trooper told me later that she didn't suffer. I have always wondered whether he said that because it was true or because that was what they were trained to say. I was on a run that weekend. I was outside of Salt Lake City when Margaret got the call. She called dispatch, and dispatch called me on the radio, and I pulled the rig over at a truck stop in Wyoming and sat in the cab for an hour before I could turn the key to come home. I drove 26 hours straight to get back. I don't remember most of that drive. I just remember the way the sun came up over Nebraska on Sunday morning, and how I kept thinking that the sun had no business being that beautiful on a day my Hannah wasn't going to see. We buried her in the cemetery behind the Methodist church in our town. Rachel was 23 at the time, just out of Ohio State, working her first real job in Columbus. She came home for the funeral, and she stayed for 10 days, and she and her mother held each other and cried in a way that I couldn't quite reach. Grief between a mother and a daughter is its own country. Sometimes a father can only stand at the border. I didn't cry at the funeral. I want to be honest about that. I cried plenty afterward, alone in the cab on long stretches of Iowa, alone in our basement at 3 in the morning, alone in the shower. But at the funeral, I held Margaret up and I shook hands with people I hadn't seen since high school, and I thanked them for coming. I think people in our town thought I was hard. I wasn't hard. I was just trying to keep my wife on her feet. Because if I let go, she was going to come apart, and I knew Rachel needed at least one parent standing. The thing nobody warns you about is what grief does to a marriage. It doesn't break it, necessarily, but it changes the shape of it. Margaret and I, for about 2 years after Hannah, lived in the same house but on different schedules of sorrow. She'd be having a good day on the same day I was sinking. I'd come home from a run feeling like I'd finally turned a corner and find her in the laundry room holding one of Hannah's old t-shirts. What it did to the account was this. We stopped for about 4 months. Then Margaret, one night in August of '06, came and sat next to me on the back porch and said, "David, we have to start again." I told her I didn't have the strength. She told me it wasn't about strength, it was about Rachel. We have one daughter now, and she is alive, and she is going to need us in ways we don't know about yet, because life isn't done with her. We have to start again. We started again in September of '06. We never missed another month after that. Not one. Not even the month Margaret was diagnosed in 2020. I think about that sometimes, about how a thing my wife and I started for both our girls became, after April of '06, a thing we kept up for one daughter who didn't know it existed. About how every envelope I mailed for the next 19 years carried the weight of 2 girls inside it, even though only one of them was still walking the earth. I haven't told Rachel about that ledger. There's a column in it for every month, going back to 1995, and at the top of the column for May of 2006, there is one small notation in Margaret's handwriting. Just 3 words. For both girls. I think about that notation a lot. I think about it most on the 5th of November. Margaret was diagnosed on a Wednesday in late September of 2020. I remember it was a Wednesday because we'd been to the farmer's market the Saturday before, and she'd bought a basket of yellow tomatoes and made a tomato pie that didn't turn out quite right, and we'd laughed about it at the table. And 4 days later, we were sitting in a small, bright room at the hospital in Marietta listening to a doctor say the word pancreatic. The doctor was a young woman with kind eyes. She told us everything in plain English, the way you'd want a doctor to. She drew a little picture on the back of a printout. She said the word stage 4. She said the word months, not years. She said there were treatments we could try, but she wanted to be honest with us about what they could and couldn't do. Margaret reached over and took my hand while the doctor was talking. She squeezed it once, the way she always did when she was about to be brave. She thanked the doctor for being straight with us. She asked 2 practical questions about pain management. She did not cry in that office. I did not cry in that office. We left, and we walked across the parking lot together, and we got into our car, and we sat there for about 20 minutes without saying a word, watching a flock of starlings move across the sky. Then Margaret said, "Well, I guess we ought to get groceries on the way home." That was Margaret. The world could end, and she'd still want to make sure there was milk in the fridge. We drove home and we made dinner. We called Rachel that evening. Rachel was on a work trip in Atlanta. She booked a flight back the next morning and was at our house by noon on Thursday. And she sat at our kitchen table with red eyes and asked all the questions the doctor had already answered. Margaret answered them again, patiently. The way she'd answered Rachel's questions about her algebra homework in 1998. The treatments started a week later. They went the way the doctor said they would go. Margaret lost weight she couldn't spare. She lost her hair. She kept her sense of humor about most of it. Though there were nights when I'd hear her in the bathroom and I knew she was crying into a towel so I wouldn't hear. And I'd lie in our bed and look at the ceiling and feel like the worst kind of useless. She lasted 9 weeks from the diagnosis. By the first week of November, she'd been moved to the hospice floor on the 6th floor of the hospital. They had a corner room with a window that looked out toward the river, and she could see the trees turning, and on a clear afternoon, she could see the bridge. I was with her every day. I'd retired from driving about 2 years before my back had finally said enough, and there was nothing to keep me anywhere but that 6th floor room. Rachel came when she could, on weekends mostly. And once for a long week in the middle, she'd hold her mother's hand and read to her from a book of poems Margaret had loved in college. The two of them were tender with each other in those last weeks, in a way I had not seen in years. Whatever distance had grown between them while Rachel was building her career, that distance fell away in that hospital room. They were just a mother and her surviving daughter, holding hands, talking about small things and large ones, while a window full of November light went pink and then gray and then dark behind them. The night of the promise was a Thursday, the 12th of November, 2020. I remember the date because the next morning was the 5th's monthly envelope, only a week late. And I sat in the chair next to Margaret's bed that night and worked out in my head whether I'd be able to get to the post office before it closed on Friday. That's the kind of thing I was thinking about. Margaret was dying, and I was thinking about Doris and the post office. The mind does what it does to get you through. Rachel had gone home to Columbus that morning. It was just me and Margaret in the room, with the heart monitor making its small, steady sounds, and the radiator clicking, and a nurse coming in every hour or so to check on her. Margaret had been mostly asleep that day. The morphine was up. She'd stir for a few minutes, smile at me, say a word or two, and drift again. Around 9 that night, she opened her eyes and they were clearer than they'd been in 3 days. Sharp. The way they'd been when she was younger. She looked right at me. David. I'm here, Maggie. Come closer. I want to tell you something. I scooted the chair right up against the bed. I took her hand. The bones of it felt like a bird's by then. I've been thinking about Cincinnati, she said. Don't worry about Cincinnati. Cincinnati's fine. Listen to me. I've been thinking about it. I want you to do something for me. After... All right, anything. I want you to promise. Maggie. David, promise. I said all right. I held her hand, and I looked at her face, and I said all right. You're not going to stop. After I'm gone, you're not going to stop. Every month. Same as we've done. Even when you don't want to. Even when you don't see the point. You keep going. I will. And David, listen. This is the important part. You don't touch it. Not for yourself. Not when you're lonely. Not when the truck breaks down. Not when the roof goes again. You promise me. I promise, Maggie. Still, you wait. You wait until one of them needs it. Until Rachel needs it. Or until the grandbabies need it. You'll know. When the time comes, you'll know. And you'll be there. Without making them ask. Just like we said in '95. I'll know. You promise. I promise you. Maggie. On my life. She closed her eyes for a long moment. I thought she'd drifted again. Then she opened them and she looked at me with a kind of slow, settled love that I have not seen on any other face in my life, before or since. You've been a good husband. David Whittaker. Don't. You have. You have been a good husband. And you've been a better father than they know. They'll know one day. That's the other part. They'll know. I didn't answer that. I couldn't. Open the top drawer in the nightstand, she said. There's an envelope. I had Rachel bring me my stationery last week. I want you to read it after I'm gone. Not before. Promise me that too. I promise. Good. She closed her eyes. Now hold my hand and tell me about the time the dog got into the chicken coop. I want to hear that story again. So I told her, one more time, about our old beagle and the chicken coop and the mess he made in 1993, and how Rachel had been 7 and Hannah had been 4, and they'd both laughed until they cried at the sight of him covered in feathers. I told it slow. I told it the way she liked it told. And before I got to the end of the story, she had drifted back into sleep, and her hand had gone soft inside mine, and her breath had settled into the slow rhythm I had been listening to every night for 38 years. She lasted 4 more days. She died early on the morning of the 16th of November, with me in the chair next to her bed and Rachel asleep on the little fold-out by the window. I felt her go before the monitor noticed. There was a moment where the room changed temperature, or seemed to, and I knew she was no longer in it. I held her hand for a long time after. I didn't wake Rachel right away. I let her have those last minutes of not knowing. Then I got up, and I touched my daughter's shoulder, and I told her her mother was gone. We buried Margaret next to Hannah in the cemetery behind the Methodist church. 4 days later, it rained. Almost everyone we knew came. Doris from the post office stood under a black umbrella at the back and did not come up to speak to me, because she knew I couldn't have spoken back. The envelope from the nightstand sat unopened on my dresser for 2 weeks. I couldn't make myself read it. Every time I picked it up, I'd set it back down. I'd promised her, after all, not before. Well, she was gone. And after had begun. And still I couldn't. I read it finally on the first Sunday of December, in the chair on the back porch, with a blanket over my legs and the river going gray under a winter sky. I won't tell you everything that was in it. Some of it is just between the two of us, and a man gets to keep some things for himself. Even now. But I'll tell you the part that matters. She wrote about the account. She wrote that she'd been thinking about it more than anything else in those last weeks. She wrote that she wanted me to understand something. She wrote, and I have the letter memorized. So I'm not making this up, David. The money isn't the point. The money was never the point. The point is that we promised each other we would build something quiet for our girls. And quiet things are the kind that matter the most in this world. When Rachel needs it, you give it to her. But more than the money, give her the meaning of it. Make sure she understands what it was. Not to make her feel guilty, to make her feel held. There is a difference. You'll know the difference when you get there. I read that letter 3 times that afternoon. Then I folded it back up, and I put it in the manila folder. And I put the folder in the bottom drawer of my dresser, on top of the ledger books and the envelopes. I turned the brass key. That was almost 5 years ago now. I have not opened that drawer more than 10 times since. I haven't needed to. I knew what was in it. I knew what she'd asked. I knew I was waiting. What I didn't know, sitting on my back porch that December afternoon in 2020, was that the waiting was going to last almost 5 years, and that when it ended, it was going to end in the worst possible way, with my daughter calling me a failed father at her own dinner table, before she'd ever know what her mother and I had quietly built for her. But Margaret had told me, "You'll know when the time comes." I just hadn't known yet that it was coming. That Sunday in October, the morning after Rachel's words had ridden home with me down Interstate 70, that was the morning the knowing started. Small at first. Just a feeling. Just a sense that the drawer in the bedroom wasn't going to stay closed much longer. I sat on the bench by the river. I watched the barge get smaller as it moved downstream. I thought about Margaret. I thought about Hannah. I thought about a 10-year-old grandson in a dinosaur sweater holding on to me at a back door like I was the only solid thing in the room. And I thought about the 5th of November, 2 days away, and the envelope already sealed on my kitchen counter. I got up off the bench when the wind started to bite. I walked home along the path through the sycamores. The first flakes of an early snow were starting to come down by the time I reached my porch. They didn't stick. They never do in early November. But there is something about the first snow of a season that always makes a man feel like a season is ending and another is beginning, and that whatever has been waiting is closer now than it was yesterday. I went inside. I hung the brown jacket on its hook. I put a fresh pot of coffee on, and I sat at my kitchen table with the envelope in front of me, and I looked at it for a long time, and I thought, 2 days. Maggie. 2 days until the 5th. We are not stopping. We have not stopped. And whatever is coming, we will be ready for it. I didn't know how. I didn't know when. But I knew. Margaret had told me I would. The 5th of November came and went the way it had for 30 years. I walked the envelope down to the post office Tuesday morning. Doris took it across the counter without looking at the address. She just slid it onto the scale, told me the postage, and gave me my receipt. The whole exchange took less than 2 minutes. It always did. Some rituals don't need words. The weeks after that party in Columbus turned cold fast. November stayed gray. The river took on that particular slate color it gets when the trees go bare. And the geese came through in their long, uneven lines, calling to each other over the house at dusk. I cleaned out the gutters on a Saturday. I split a half cord of firewood on a Sunday, the way I'd been doing every fall since we bought the house in '86. Old habits keep a man company when the new ones haven't been invented yet. I hadn't called Rachel. I hadn't expected her to call me either. That's not the kind of family we'd ever been. We weren't phone people. Margaret had been the one who held the lines together. Once she was gone, Rachel and I had defaulted to whatever silence was easiest, which is to say, a long one, punctuated by birthdays and Christmas and the occasional text message about the weather. It wasn't right, but it was what we'd settled into. After the dinner in Columbus, the silence settled in deeper. So when the phone rang on a Wednesday morning the second week of November, and I saw Rachel's name on the screen, it took me a second to remember to answer it. "Hello, sweetheart." "Dad." Her voice was tight. I could hear traffic in the background. She was in her car. "Hi, I listen. I'm calling to ask a favor." "All right." "Marcus and I have something we need to handle this weekend. Out of town. It came up suddenly. And the babysitter we usually use had a death in the family, and the backup is sick. And I was wondering, I know it's last minute, but could Eli come stay with you? Friday night through Sunday afternoon, just Eli. Maddie's going to her friend Sophie's." She said it fast. There was an apology baked into the speed of it, but she didn't actually apologize. And I noticed she also didn't ask about how I was doing. She didn't bring up Eli's party. She didn't bring up what she'd said. She just asked, the way you ask a neighbor to bring in your mail. A part of me wanted to say no. I won't pretend otherwise. There's a kind of pride in a man my age that gets prickly at being needed only when it's convenient. I let the moment sit for half a breath. Then I thought about Eli at the back door in the dinosaur sweater, and I thought about Margaret, and I said, "Sure, Friday night through Sunday. Bring him on down." She let out a breath I don't think she knew she'd been holding. "Thank you. Really. I appreciate it, Dad. I'll bring him by around 6 on Friday." "You driving, or is Marcus?" "I am. Marcus he's already on his way. I'll come straight from work." "All right, I'll have dinner on." There was a pause then. I could hear her turn signal clicking through the phone. I could hear her thinking about something she didn't want to say. "Dad, about the other night." "It's all right, Rachel. It's not. I had too much wine, and there was a lot going on at work, and I shouldn't have." "Sweetheart, let's talk about it when you've got time to actually talk. Not in the car." "All right, just bring me my grandson Friday." She was quiet again. Then she said, "Okay. Thank you, Dad. I'll see you Friday." We hung up. I stood at the kitchen window with the phone still in my hand for a long minute, watching a squirrel work over a hickory nut on the porch railing. I had too much wine. There was a lot going on at work. That was what she said. That's what people say when the truth has more legs than they want to chase down. But there was something in her voice, that breath she'd let out when I said yes, that told me the lot going on wasn't as small as a busy week. I didn't know what it was yet. I just knew it was something. And whatever it was, she was bringing it to my doorstep on Friday in the form of a 10-year-old boy in an overnight bag. I called Doris on her cell that afternoon and asked if she had any of those homemade cinnamon rolls left in her freezer, the kind she sells at the bake sale at the Methodist church every spring. She said she had 2 trays. I asked her to set one aside for me. She did not ask why. Doris doesn't ask. I went to the grocery store Thursday morning. I bought the kind of cereal Eli liked, the chocolate kind, which Margaret would have rolled her eyes at, and a half-gallon of whole milk, and hot dogs, and the buns to go with them, and a frozen pizza for Saturday night, and a bag of apples in case any nutrition needed to happen by accident. I bought a fishing magazine for myself, because I figured we'd want something to talk about over breakfast that wasn't on a screen. I bought a new package of plain white socks because Eli always seemed to forget socks. I came home and I set up the spare bedroom, the one that had been Hannah's, then Rachel's after Hannah was gone, and now nobody's. I put fresh sheets on the bed. I dusted the dresser. I opened the window for half an hour to let the closed-up smell out. There were still some of Hannah's books on the shelf, her old field guides to birds and trees, which I hadn't been able to move, and I left them right where they were. Eli was old enough to notice them, and I wasn't planning to explain unless he asked. Some things you let kids come to in their own time. By Friday afternoon, I had the cinnamon rolls thawing on the counter, a pot of chili on the stove the way Margaret used to make it, and the porch light on, and I was sitting in the kitchen pretending to read the fishing magazine, which I had been reading for 2 hours and was somewhere on page 4. I want to tell you that I was relaxed. I wasn't. I was nervous. In a way I hadn't been nervous for a long time. Not because I was scared of Eli, because I knew, the way a man knows things he hasn't been told, that this weekend was going to matter. I didn't have a reason for that knowing. I just had it. Margaret used to say I got those feelings because I'd spent too many years on the road with nothing but instinct and weather between me and a ditch. You learn to feel things the rest of us miss. David, you just don't always have the words for them. I didn't have the words for it that Friday afternoon either. I just kept getting up to check the chili, and check the porch light, and check the spare bedroom one more time, and check my watch. And finally, at 5 minutes past 6, I heard the crunch of Rachel's Lexus on the gravel drive. I went out to meet them on the porch. Rachel was already getting Eli's overnight bag out of the trunk. She'd come straight from work. She was wearing a navy blue suit, and her hair was pulled back the way she wore it for client meetings. And even from the porch, I could see she'd been crying earlier in the day. Her makeup had been touched up, but it hadn't been touched up well enough. Eli came up the porch steps in his coat and stocking cap, dragging a backpack that was almost as big as he was. He saw me, dropped the backpack on the porch, and ran into my legs. "Easy, son, easy." I brought my truck book, the one I told you about, with all the pictures. Did you? Well, we'll need to make some time to look at it. Rachel came up the steps behind him with the overnight bag. She set it down on the porch. She looked at me for a second without saying anything, and I think she was trying to decide whether to say something else about Friday night 2 weeks ago. I gave her the smallest shake of my head. "Not now. Not in front of him." She got it. "I packed his toothbrush," she said. "His medicine for the asthma is in the front pocket, just in case. He hasn't needed it in a while, but I want you to have it. There's pajamas. His tablet is in there. But Dad, please don't let him be on it past 8. He won't sleep." "I won't." And his sister told him a scary story about ghosts last week, so if he wakes up... "Rachel, he'll be fine." She nodded. She didn't argue. That was new. The Rachel I'd known the last 10 years would have argued just to feel like she was the one in charge of the arrangement. This Rachel just nodded. She bent down and hugged Eli for longer than she usually did. I watched her face over his shoulder. Her eyes were closed and her jaw was tight, and I saw her swallow, and I knew she was working hard not to come apart in front of him. "You be good for Grandpa," she said. "I'll see you Sunday." "Bye, Mom." She straightened up. She gave me a small nod. "Sunday around 4. Dad." "Drive safe, sweetheart." She did not hug me. I noticed, but I didn't hold it against her. We weren't there yet. She went back down the steps, got in the Lexus, and pulled out of the drive. Eli waved at the taillights as they went. When the car was gone, he turned to me with his face full of that 10-year-old expectancy that the next 48 hours were going to be the best of his life. "What's for dinner, Grandpa?" "Chili. Your grandma's recipe. Come on in." I picked up his backpack, and he picked up the overnight bag, and we went inside, and I shut the door against the November cold. I did not know yet that he was going to say something to me at the kitchen sink on Saturday night that was going to send me to Cincinnati on a Monday morning with a brass key in my pocket and my hands shaking on the wheel. He was just a boy with chili to eat, and I was just his grandfather, glad of his company. We had a good Friday night, Eli and I. I want to set that down before I get to the harder part, because the good is important. The good is what made the rest of it bearable. He ate 2 bowls of chili at the kitchen table. He told me about a kid at school who'd brought a snake in for show and tell that had somehow gotten loose, and the gym teacher had stood up on a chair and screamed. He laughed so hard at his own telling of it that he got the hiccups, and I had to get him a glass of water and slap him on the back. Margaret used to do the same for me. There's something about watching a child laugh until they can't breathe, something about the absolute trust of it. The way they hand the moment over to you to fix, that goes straight through a man my age and reaches all the way down to whatever's left of his own boyhood. After dinner, we did the dishes together. He stood on a stool because he wasn't quite tall enough to reach the sink properly, and he dried while I washed. He worked carefully. He took his time with each piece. He noticed that one of Margaret's blue plates had a little chip in the rim, and he asked me about it. And I told him she'd dropped it back in 1998 when our beagle came running through the kitchen. And Eli wanted to know what kind of beagle. And I told him a fat one named Biscuit, who died at the age of 14 and was buried under the elm out back. He absorbed all of this with the seriousness of a small historian. We watched a baseball movie I'd seen 6 times, and he hadn't seen once. He fell asleep on the couch with his head on my arm before it was over. I carried him up to the spare bedroom heavier than I expected. My back complained about it the next morning and tucked him in under one of Margaret's old quilts. He stirred just long enough to mumble "Thanks, Grandpa," and rolled over. I stood in the doorway for a minute and watched him sleep. The hallway light was on behind me, and a slice of it fell across the foot of the bed. He looked small in there. He looked like his mother had looked when she'd been about that age, sleeping in a different house with a different quilt over her, with me in the doorway because I'd just come in from a 4-day run and I'd wanted to see her face before I went to bed. I closed the door soft, and I went to my own room. I sat on the edge of the bed for a minute. I did not open the drawer that night. But I will tell you, I looked at it for a while. I looked at it and I thought about Rachel in her navy suit and her makeup that hadn't held. And I thought about that breath she'd let out when I'd said yes on the phone. And I thought about what Margaret had said in the hospital. "You'll know when the time comes." I didn't know yet, but I was starting to feel the shape of something. Saturday morning, we went fishing. There's a spot down on the river. about a mile downstream from the bench I sit on, where my brother and I used to go when we were boys. The bank slopes gentle there, and there's a flat rock that fits two people, and the water comes up slow against it, without any current to speak of. I took Eli down there with our cane poles and a coffee can full of worms I dug up from under the elm. He caught 3 catfish. I caught 1. He was beside himself about the math of it. I beat you, Grandpa. I beat you fair and square. I told him fishing wasn't a competition. He told me everything was a competition. I told him his mother had said the same thing when she was 9. He thought about that for a while. We had grilled cheese for lunch, the kind I always burn a little because I like the edges crispy. Eli ate 2 of them and asked for a third. We took a walk through the woods behind the house in the afternoon. I showed him the elm where the dog was buried, and the stump where I'd been sitting when I decided to ask his grandmother to marry me back in 1982, and the old well that didn't work anymore, but still had its hand pump on it. He pumped the handle a few times to hear it creak. We made pizza together for supper Saturday night, frozen pizza, but Eli helped me put extra cheese on top, which was his idea, and he was very proud of it. We ate at the kitchen table. He told me about a girl in his class who'd been mean to him about his glasses. He told me his dad had been working a lot of late nights. He told me he didn't know what foreclosure meant. He said the word the way kids say words they've overheard. I set down my pizza. I made myself be very careful with the next sentence. "Where'd you hear that word, son?" Mom said it. To Dad, in the kitchen. Last week. She said we cannot let this go to foreclosure. And I asked her what it meant, and she said it was a grown-up word and not to worry about it. But I looked it up on her tablet. He took another bite of pizza. "It means when the bank takes your house." I sat with that for a second. "That's about right," I said. "Sort of." "Are they going to take our house, Grandpa?" He asked it the way a 10-year-old asks a question straight on, without padding, looking right at me with his fork halfway to his mouth. There was no fear in it yet, because he hadn't worked out yet that there was something to be afraid of. He was just asking because he wanted to know. I took a long breath. I weighed what to say. A man can lie to a child to protect him, but a child can always tell. They might not know they can tell, but they can. So I went for the version of the truth that left room. "I don't know everything that's going on with your mom and dad, son. But I'll tell you this. Grandpas exist for a reason. And one of the reasons grandpas exist is to make sure their grandsons have a roof over their heads. You and your sister. You've got me. Whatever happens. You've got me. That's a fact. And you can write it down." He looked at me for a long second. Then he nodded. Slow. The way he'd nodded at the catfish when he'd weighed them in his hands. "Okay, Grandpa. Okay." He went back to his pizza. I did not. I sat there at the kitchen table looking at my own plate and feeling the floor move underneath me. The way the floor of a long-haul cab moves underneath you on a stretch of bad asphalt, slow and continuous. Not enough to throw you, but enough that you know the road has changed. We did the dishes again. Eli dried. We talked about other things, easier things. The catfish, mostly, and a movie he wanted me to watch with him on his tablet, which I let him do for an hour because the rule was 8 o'clock, and we still had until 8. He fell asleep on the couch again before the movie was over. I carried him up again. My back complained louder this time. I went down to the kitchen. I did not turn on the overhead light. I just sat at the table in the dark, with the porch light coming in through the side window. And I thought about Rachel's face on the porch in the navy suit. Marcus is already on his way. I thought about her makeup that hadn't been touched up well enough. I thought about we cannot let this go to foreclosure. I thought about that boy upstairs asleep in his grandma's old quilt, who'd asked me at the dinner table if the bank was going to take his house. I sat there until the porch light started to flicker the way it does on cold nights, and the furnace kicked on, and the kitchen clock read just past 11. Then I got up, and I went back to my bedroom, and I knelt down at the bottom drawer of the dresser. I put the brass key in the lock. I opened it. I took out the most recent bank statement from the top of the stack. I looked at the balance. I had been keeping track in my head, of course, but I wanted to see it in print. $402,118.44. I looked at it for a long time. Then I took out the manila folder. I opened it. I read Margaret's letter for the first time in almost 5 years by the light of the bedside lamp. I read it slow. I read every word. When Rachel needs it, you give it to her. But more than the money, give her the meaning of it. Make sure she understands what it was. Not to make her feel guilty, to make her feel held. I read it twice. Then I closed the folder, and I closed the drawer, and I sat back on my heels with my hands on my thighs, and I said out loud to the empty room, to my wife who hadn't been in that room for almost 5 years, "All right, Maggie, all right. I think we're getting close." Sunday went the way Friday and Saturday had gone, only quieter. Eli was a little tired. We did puzzles at the kitchen table. We watched the river from the porch. He helped me bring in firewood from the side of the garage. He didn't ask any more questions about foreclosure. I think he'd put it away in the back of his head for safekeeping, the way kids do. I had put nothing away. The whole 48 hours had been rearranging itself in me, sliding into a new shape. And by the time Rachel pulled up the gravel drive at 4 o'clock Sunday afternoon, I had begun to know what Margaret had been talking about. Rachel got out of the Lexus in jeans and a sweater. No makeup this time. She'd given up on it for the day. She came up the porch steps, and Eli ran past me into her arms, and she held him for a long moment with her face buried in the top of his head. She looked at me over his shoulder. "How was he, Dad?" "He was wonderful. He always is." "Thank you. I mean it. Thank you." "Anytime, sweetheart." She gathered up the bag, the backpack, the extra socks I'd folded into a Ziploc, the leftover pizza in a piece of foil that Eli insisted on bringing home. She buckled him in. She came back up the steps for one last hand of goodbye and stopped at the bottom step. "Dad." "Yes, sweetheart." She opened her mouth. She closed it. She looked down at the porch boards for a second, and then back up at me. "I'll call you this week." "All right." "I will. I promise." "All right, Rachel." She got in the car. She drove away. I stood on the porch and watched the Lexus turn out onto the road, and I waited until I couldn't see the taillights anymore. And then I went inside and called Doris. "Doris, it's David Whitaker. I need a favor." All right, David. You still got that nephew of yours who works at the title office in Columbus. Tommy, yes. I'm going to need a phone number for him, and I'm going to need it tonight, if it's all the same to you. She did not ask why. That's the thing about Doris. She never asks. She just goes and gets the number. 20 minutes later, my phone rang, and Tommy was on the other end. And I asked him a quiet question about the public records of a property in a certain subdivision in Columbus. And he told me he'd get back to me Monday morning. He did. By 11 o'clock Monday morning, I had what I needed. I drove to Cincinnati that afternoon. The community bank where Margaret and I had opened our account in November of '95 was a small brick building in a neighborhood called Oakley, in the eastern part of Cincinnati. It had a green awning over the front door and the same gold lettering on the window that it had had since the '70s. The cousin who'd helped us open the account back then had retired in 2007. The woman who'd taken over our account was named Helen Wexler, and she'd been managing things for me ever since. Helen knew me. She'd seen me twice a year for almost 20 years. I drove down once in the spring and once in the fall to go over statements and have a cup of coffee with her, just as a way to keep the relationship human, and she'd been at Margaret's funeral, sitting in the back, in a black coat with a gray scarf I still remembered. She'd never written. She'd never called to express her condolences in any way that would have intruded. She had simply showed up at the cemetery and stood in the rain and gone home, and that had been the only condolence I had needed from her. I called Helen Monday morning before I drove down. I told her I'd be in around 2. I told her I needed to discuss something. She said she'd block the time. I made the drive down to Cincinnati in my old Chevy. It's about 3 hours, taking the back way through Chillicothe. I didn't put the radio on. I drank my coffee from the thermos. I watched the country roll past the bare November fields, the abandoned silos, the little towns where the only thing moving was a flag on a flagpole, and I thought about what I was going to say to Helen when I sat down across from her. I thought about Rachel, too, about the call she'd promised, about whether she'd actually make it, about what I would say if she did, and what I would say if she didn't. I pulled into the bank parking lot just before 2. The lot was almost empty. I sat in the truck for a minute before I went in. I patted my coat pocket to make sure the brass key was there. I'd brought it with me. I don't know why. There was nothing for it to open in Cincinnati, but I had not been willing to leave the house without it. It had felt important to have it on me. Helen met me at her desk. She is a small woman in her early 60s, with silver hair cut short and reading glasses on a chain around her neck. She gave me a real hug, not a polite one. She told me I looked well. I told her I was getting by. She asked me about Rachel. I told her Rachel was the reason I'd come. "All right," she said. She sat down behind her desk. She put on her glasses. She pulled up the account on her screen and turned the screen so I could see it. $402,118.44 in the primary savings. 2 trust accounts beside it. One in the name of Madison Bennett, established November of 2020. Current balance $78,412. The other in the name of Elijah Bennett. Same establishment date. Same current balance to the dollar. Margaret had insisted, on her hospital bed, that the trusts be exactly equal, no matter what. I sat and looked at the numbers for a minute. Helen waited. She'd been a banker long enough to know that some men need a minute to look. Helen, I'm going to need to do some things this week. All right, David. I need to know what the steps look like. I'm not asking you to do them today. I'm asking you to tell me what they look like. Tell me what you want to do, and I'll tell you the steps. I told her. I told her about Rachel, about Marcus, about a property in a subdivision in Columbus that was about 30 days from going to foreclosure auction. According to what Tommy at the title office had told me Monday morning, about a payoff number that I did not yet know exactly, but that I was guessing fell somewhere in the high 300s. I told her I wanted to know if the savings could cover the payoff, if I could keep the two trusts untouched, and if I could have everything ready to present by the following weekend. Helen listened without interrupting. She wrote some things down on a yellow pad. When I was done, she pushed her glasses up onto her head. David, she said, has the time come? Then I had to look at the window for a second. The afternoon sun was coming through the green awning out front and laying a soft green stripe across her desk. I think it has, Helen. She nodded, just once. All right, then let's get the steps in order. She walked me through it. She asked me practical questions and gave me practical answers. She told me what we could do by phone and what would need a signature. She told me she could have certified bank checks ready by Thursday. She told me that, with the title office's payoff number in hand, she could draft an instrument that would clear the entire lien against Rachel's house, in Rachel's name, with the lender, in one transaction. The two trust accounts, in Margaret's and my joint names with the grandchildren as beneficiaries, would not be touched. The remaining savings, whatever was left after the payoff, would stay in the account, untouched, and continue to be Rachel's safety net for whatever came next in her life. I listened. I took it in. I asked a couple of questions I needed to ask. I signed 2 preliminary forms. I shook her hand. Before I left, Helen walked me to the door. She paused with her hand on the frame. David, I was at her funeral. I want you to know I think about her. I know you do, Helen. She would be proud of you today. I had to look down the sidewalk for a second. She set this whole thing up. Helen, I'm just the one mailing the envelopes. That's not true, and you know it. I nodded. I couldn't trust my voice. I tipped my hat to her, the way I'd been tipping hats to women my whole life, and I went out to the truck. I drove out of Cincinnati and got onto 71 heading north. I had not planned to stop at Dale's, but somewhere around Westchester, I felt my hands needing a wheel to grip differently, and my eyes needing something familiar to look at. And I took the exit for a diner I had not been to in 11 years. Dale's Diner sits off Interstate 70 in a strip of road I drove 1,000 times in my working life. It is the kind of place where the menus are laminated and the coffee is poured before you ask for it. Dale himself had been dead for 6 years, but his daughter Linda still ran the place. And when I walked in, she was at the register, and she stopped what she was doing and stared at me for a second. David Whitaker, as I live and breathe. Linda, get over here. She came around the counter and hugged me. Hard. The kind of hug you give a man you used to feed on a weekly basis. She asked about Margaret without asking, by way of how her eyes went soft, and I told her without telling, by way of the small shake of my head, and she nodded and put me in a booth by the window and brought me coffee. I ordered the apple pie. I asked for it warm. She brought it with a slice of cheddar on the side, the way Dale always served it. I had not had a slice of pie like that in 11 years. I sat in that booth for almost an hour. The afternoon sun came through the window. I thought about all the times I'd sat in this very booth at 2 in the morning, with snow blowing against the glass, eating Dale's meatloaf and reading whatever paperback I'd had in the cab. I thought about how many of those nights I'd done the math in my head, calculating what I could send home, what I could keep for fuel, what I could put in the envelope to Cincinnati. I thought about how Rachel had grown up while I was sitting in booths like this one, about all the school plays I had not gone to, all the soccer games, all the birthdays I'd phoned in from rest stops in Iowa, about what she had felt, sitting at our kitchen table on Vine Street with her mother across from her, while her father was hundreds of miles away in a diner. I had thought, all those years, that I was earning her something, that the money was the way I was loving her. I had believed it, the way Margaret had believed it, and maybe we had been right. The money had built a house. It had paid a college tuition. It had grown into a quiet thing in a Cincinnati bank that was, this very afternoon, about to save Rachel from losing the only home her children had ever known. But sitting in Dale's, eating pie, I had not eaten in 11 years. I also let myself know, really know, for the first time that the money had not been enough. That Rachel's voice on Friday night 2 weeks ago had been the voice of a little girl who had needed her father at the kitchen table and had gotten an envelope from Wyoming instead. Both things could be true. I was old enough now to hold them both. I paid Linda. I tipped her too much. She did not argue. I told her I'd be back. She told me I'd better. I got in the truck. I drove home. I came up the gravel drive a little after 7 that night. The porch light was on, the way I always left it. I went inside. I hung the brown jacket on its hook. I sat down at the kitchen table. I did not eat dinner. I was not hungry. I sat there for a long time, with the table empty in front of me, and I thought about what I was going to do. By the time I went to bed, I had a plan. It was a simple plan. It had 3 steps. Step 1. I would call Rachel on Wednesday and tell her I needed her and Marcus to come down to my house on Sunday evening. I would not tell her why. Step 2. I would drive back down to Cincinnati on Thursday and pick up the certified checks from Helen, along with the lien payoff instrument. Step 3. Sunday evening, when they sat down at my kitchen table, I would set down a craft envelope with everything inside it, and I would tell my daughter, in plain words, what her mother and I had built for her over 30 years. I would not give a speech. I would not lecture her about the dinner in Columbus. I would not bring up the word failed. I would just do what Margaret had asked me to do, the way she had asked me to do it. I would give Rachel the money, and I would give her the meaning of it, and I would let her decide what to do with both. That was my plan. That was what I went to bed with on Monday night. I did not know, lying there in the dark, with the brass key on the nightstand beside me, that the plan was going to hold up exactly. I did not know that my daughter would actually come on Sunday. I did not know that what I had been waiting 30 years to put on a table was about to land on it. But I had a feeling. The same feeling I'd had in the cab, 1,000 times. When I knew a storm was 3 hours out and that I was going to make it home in time, if I just kept driving and didn't second-guess myself. Loose hands, David. Loose hands and a clear eye. I went to sleep. I called Rachel on Wednesday morning, the way I'd planned. She picked up on the second ring. I could tell from the sound of her voice that she had been waiting for the phone to ring all week, though probably not for me to be the one ringing it. Hi. Sweetheart, I need a favor this time. There was a small pause, and I knew she'd braced herself the way people brace when they're already running on too little reserve. I tried to take the brace out of my voice. It's not a hard one. I'd like for you and Marcus to come down here on Sunday. For supper. Around 5 would be good. There's something I'd like to talk to the two of you about, and I'd rather do it at my kitchen table than over the phone. She was quiet for a beat. Is everything all right, Dad? Is it your health? No, sweetheart. Nothing like that. I'm fine. It's not bad news. I just want you both down here. Sunday at 5? Sunday at 5. Should I bring anything? Just yourselves and Marcus? Okay. Another pause. Dad, about my promise to call. I'm sorry, Rachel, Sunday. Come on Sunday. We'll talk then. All right, we'll be there. We hung up. I sat with the phone in my hand at the kitchen table and listened to the furnace turn itself on. And I thought, that's the call done. Now the rest of it. Thursday morning, I drove back down to Cincinnati. Helen had everything ready, just like she said she would. 2 certified bank checks. The first, the larger one, made out to the mortgage lender in the exact amount that Tommy had confirmed from the title office on Tuesday. The second, a smaller check, made out to Rachel directly. A cushion to cover the closing costs and the legal fees, and a little breathing room afterward. Helen handed me the manila folder across her desk. Inside were the checks, a copy of the lien payoff instrument, a printout of the savings account showing the new balance, 2 updated statements for the trust accounts in Madison's and Eli's names, and one more thing Helen had added without me asking, a single sheet of paper that summarized, in plain English, what each of those documents was and what it did. In case she doesn't take in what you say in the moment, Helen said. She'll want to read it later. People always do. I thanked her. I drove back up to Marietta in the dark. I came through the door a little before 8 that night. I put the folder on the kitchen table. I made myself a fried egg sandwich, the way Margaret used to make me one after every important conversation, and I ate it standing up at the counter. Friday, I went down to the post office. The 5th of the month was still 9 days off, but I wanted to drop in. I think I wanted Doris to see me. I'd been carrying the weekend around in my body for 3 days by then, and the post office was the closest thing I had to a church. She looked up when the bell over the door rang. David, you're early this month. Just visiting, Doris. She studied me for a second over her glasses. Got a lot on your mind. A bit. You all right? I'm all right. Doris, I just wanted to say thank you for the cinnamon rolls last week and for Tommy's number. She waved a hand. Don't be silly. You'd have done the same. Probably, but I wanted to say it. She looked at me a moment longer. Then she said, very quiet, Margaret would be proud of you, David. Whatever it is, she would be proud. I had to look at the bulletin board on the wall for a second. I don't know how Doris knew. I'd never told her any of it. I'd never told anyone any of it. But there are people who can read a man's whole life off the way he carries his shoulders into a room. And Doris was one of them. I went home. I split a little more firewood. I called Eli on Saturday afternoon to tell him I missed his help on the stack. He told me about a math test. He told me Maddie had been in a bad mood. He told me his mom had been quiet a lot. I told him to be patient with her. I told him to remember that adults have weather too, the way kids do. He said he'd try. Sunday morning came on overcast and still. The river was a flat gray. The geese had all gone south for the year. I'd been up since 4. I'd already had 2 cups of coffee by the time the sun came up, and I'd been over the plan in my head probably 20 times. I cleaned the house, not because Rachel would notice, but because I needed something for my hands. I swept the kitchen. I wiped down the table. I changed the light bulb in the dining room because it had been flickering for a month, and tonight was the wrong night for a flickering bulb. I went down to the basement and brought up Margaret's good casserole dish. I made her pot roast the recipe she'd made every Sunday for 38 years. The one with the carrots and the small white potatoes and the kind of gravy that you didn't need bread for. But you ate bread with anyway because the gravy was that good. I set the table for 3. I used the blue plates Eli had asked about, the ones with the chip in the rim. I lit a candle in a little jar that had been a wedding gift from somebody we'd lost touch with in 2003. I put a piece of cornbread in the oven to warm. I went into my bedroom at 4 o'clock. I knelt down at the drawer. I opened it. I took everything out, the 2 ledger books, the 30 years of canceled money order stubs, bundled in their rubber bands, the most recent bank statement, the manila folder with Margaret's letter inside it, and the second manila folder Helen had given me, with the checks and the documents. I carried all of it out to the kitchen and laid it on the counter, behind a tea towel, where it would be out of sight from the table but I could reach it without having to leave the room. The craft envelope with the checks, the documents, and Helen's plain English summary I set on top. Ready to go. Then I sat down at the kitchen table and I waited. I want to tell you something honest. I was scared. Not of Rachel. Not of Marcus. I was scared of doing it wrong. I was scared that I would open my mouth and the wrong words would come out angry words. Righteous words. The words of a man who had been called a failed father by his own daughter in front of his grandson, and who had been carrying that wound for 2.5 months. I was scared that the meanness I had been putting down every morning would come up out of me at the worst possible moment and ruin what Margaret had built. I sat at the table and I closed my eyes and I said, very quiet, Maggie, help me get this right. The clock on the stove ticked. The pot roast simmered. The candle in the little jar burned down 1/2 inch. At 5 minutes past 5, the headlights of Rachel's Lexus swung across the kitchen window, and I heard the gravel of the drive, and I heard the engine cut, and I heard the 2 doors open and close. I stood up. I smoothed the front of my shirt, the blue button down again, the one Margaret had bought me, and I went to the door. Rachel and Marcus came up the porch steps together. Marcus was carrying a bottle of wine in a brown bag, the way he always did, though I never drank it, and he knew that. Rachel was in jeans and a soft cream sweater. No makeup. Her hair was down. She looked younger than she had at the party. She also looked very, very tired. I held the door open for them. Marcus shook my hand. Rachel did not hug me, but she put her hand on my arm for a second as she passed, which was more than she'd given me in 5 years. I'll take it. Smells incredible, Dad, she said. Pot roast. Your mother's... She went still for half a second. Then she nodded and went to the kitchen and started looking for the corkscrew without asking. The way you do in a house you grew up dropping in and out of, even after you'd stopped really coming. We ate. We talked about nothing. The way you talk about nothing when there is something large in the room and nobody wants to look at it yet. We talked about the weather, about Eli and how he'd done on his math test, about Maddie's volleyball team. Marcus asked me, with what I think was honest interest, whether I'd thought about going down to Florida this winter. I told him I had not. I told him I'd done my driving. He laughed at that, kind of, and Rachel almost smiled. The candle burned down another half-inch. Outside the kitchen window, the dusk turned to dark. When Marcus had cleared his plate, and Rachel had pushed hers away with half a potato still on it, I stood up. I went to the counter. I took the tea towel off the craft envelope. I brought it back to the table and laid it down on the wood between the two of them. I did not sit down right away. I went to the cupboard above the refrigerator instead, the one I almost never opened. I reached up and took down the thermos. It was the bottle I had carried in the cab of my Peterbilt for the last 11 years of my career, and in 3 trucks before that. The enamel was chipped around the lid. The body had a long scar down one side from where I had dropped it on the loading dock in Salt Lake City in 2004. The base of it had been wrapped in electrical tape since sometime in the mid-90s to keep it from sliding on a dashboard. I set the thermos on the table next to the envelope. Then I sat down. Rachel was looking at the thermos. Marcus was looking at the envelope. Neither of them was looking at me. I want to tell you both a story, I said. It's going to take a few minutes. I'd like for you to hear me out. Rachel raised her eyes to me. Her hands had gone still on her wine glass. Okay. Dad. I started in November of 1995. I told them about the kitchen on Vine Street, about the rain on the window, about Margaret with the bills in front of her, about what she had been afraid of, and what she had proposed, and what we had decided to do. I told them about the first deposit, $42.16. I told them about how the deposits had grown, year by year, and how I had kept them up through Hannah's death. I saw Rachel's face when I said her sister's name, and I made myself keep going, and through Margaret's diagnosis, and through the 5 years since the funeral. I told them about the promise, about the 6th floor room, about Margaret reaching for my hand with her bird-bone fingers and making me swear that I would not stop, and that I would not touch the money for myself, and that I would wait until one of them needed it, and that I would know when the time was. I told them about the brass key, and about the drawer, and about the fact that I had been carrying that key in my pocket for almost 5 years, and had not been sure, until 2 weekends ago, why I was still carrying it. I told them about Eli at the kitchen sink, about the word foreclosure, about the question he had asked me with his fork halfway to his mouth. Rachel had her hand over her face by then. She was not making a sound. Marcus was sitting very still, with both of his hands on the edge of the table, the way a man sits when he is trying not to fall over. I picked up the craft envelope and I slid it across the table to Rachel. I did not open it. I let her open it. She did, slowly. She pulled out the printout of the savings account first. She looked at the balance. She looked at it for a long time. She handed it to Marcus without saying anything. He looked at it. He set it down on the table very carefully. The way you would set down a thing you were afraid would break. She pulled out the statements for the trust accounts next. One in Madison's name. One in Elijah's name. The same balance to the dollar, the way Margaret had insisted. Rachel made a small sound when she saw her son's full name, Elijah Bennett, printed across the top of an account that had been opened the month her mother died. She pressed her hand against her mouth harder. She pulled out the lien payoff instrument last. She read the top of it. She read it again. She turned to the second page. She read the amount. She looked at Marcus. Marcus was crying, quietly, the kind of crying a man does when he has been holding something for months, and his body has finally found a place to set it down. Rachel laid the documents flat on the table. She put both of her hands flat on top of them, the way you would put your hands on a piece of paper that might blow away. She said, "Dad!" She could not get out anything else. I sat across the table from her, and I let the silence stay. I did not fill it. I had learned a long time ago, in the cab of a truck on a stretch of road with bad weather coming, that you do not steer into a skid by jerking the wheel. You hold it. You hold it loose and you let the road come back under you. After a long while, she said it again. "Dad." "I'm right here, sweetheart. How long has this? 30 years. Same as I told you. Your mother and me both. Together. All 30. You every month? Every month, since November of '95. Dad. Dad. I at the party. I said I told everyone you were a... Rachel. No, I said it. I called you. Rachel, look at me. She looked at me. Her face was wet. Her eyes were red. Her hair had come loose on one side and she had not noticed. I had practiced the next sentence about 100 times in the cab of my old Chevy over the last 6 days. I had said it out loud to the windshield. I had said it to the field beyond Chillicothe and to the bench by the river and to the empty kitchen at 3 in the morning. I had wanted to make sure it came out the way Margaret would have wanted it to come out, not with bitterness, not with triumph, not as a comeback to what had been said at her dinner table on a Friday night in October. As a truth. As the thing I had been waiting 30 years to say out loud to my own girl. I took a breath. I let it out. "Oh, sweetheart," I said. "I don't have the education to make you proud of me on a red carpet, but I have had enough sweat in my life to make sure that your children are never going to have to sleep in a car." She broke then. She put her head down on the kitchen table, on top of all those documents, and she cried the way a person cries when they have just looked at themselves in a mirror for the first time and seen who they have actually been. It was not loud. It was not pretty. It was just honest. She was 41 years old, and she had spent a portion of those years being ashamed of the man who had been quietly saving her life since before she was old enough to read. Marcus reached out and put his hand on the back of her neck. He left it there. He did not look at me. I think he could not look at me. That was all right. I was not asking him to look at me. He had not been the one to call me anything. The reckoning on this night was between me and my daughter. I got up from the table. I went around it. I did not put my hand on Rachel's head. I did not pull her up into a hug. There are kinds of grief and kinds of shame that need to finish their work in a person before another person can reach into them. And I knew enough not to interrupt. I went to the counter. I picked up the brass key from where I had set it earlier, beside the bread basket. I came back to the table. I set the key down on top of the craft envelope. Gently. From now on, I said. The drawer doesn't lock anymore. You can come read the ledgers any time. You and Marcus both. You can ask any question you want about any of it. There aren't any more secrets between us. Rachel, there never should have been. I'm sorry your mother and I waited as long as we did. She lifted her head. Her makeup, what there had been of it, was gone entirely now. She looked up at me with the face of the 4-year-old who'd waited 2 days past her birthday for me to come home from Wyoming, and the face of the 41-year-old who had just had every wrong assumption of her adult life corrected at her father's kitchen table. Both at once. She did not say anything. She did not have anything to say yet. She just reached up and took my hand, and she held it, and I let her hold it. I stood next to my daughter at my kitchen table with my hand in hers for a long time. Long enough that the candle in the little jar finally burned itself out, and the kitchen smelled like cornbread and smoke and pot roast and Margaret's pot roast gravy, and the wind picked up outside and rattled a loose piece of trim on the porch that I had been meaning to fix since September. That was the moment, if I had to pick one. That was the moment 30 years of quiet finally finished being quiet. And the love that had been folded inside it for all that time opened up the way a piece of paper opens when you finally unfold it. I am 62 years old. I have done a lot of long drives. I have seen a lot of country. I have been called a lot of things in a lot of places, in cabs and at counters and across dinner tables. That moment at my own kitchen table, with my daughter's hand in mine and my dead wife's pot roast on the plates and a brass key sitting on top of an envelope full of paper that was about to save my grandchildren's home, that was the moment I knew, for sure, what Margaret had meant when she had told me, on a hospital bed in November of 2020. They'll know one day. They knew. That was what mattered. That was the only thing that had ever mattered. After a while, Rachel let go of my hand. She wiped her face with the back of her wrist. She looked at Marcus. Marcus looked at her. Without a word between them, they began to gather the documents back into the craft envelope. The way a person gathers something they are not yet sure how to hold, but know they must not lose. Rachel stood up. Her knees were a little unsteady. Marcus stood with her. He put one hand on the small of her back, and I saw, for the first time in a long while, the way he loves her quiet and steady and not for show. Maybe Marcus and I will end up being the kind of men who can sit on a porch together someday. We have not gotten there yet, but I saw, that Sunday night, that the road to that porch was not as long as I had thought it was. "Dad," Rachel said. Her voice was raw. I don't know how to." "Sweetheart, you don't have to know yet. We have time. I want to." "Rachel." She stopped. Take the envelope. Take it home. Read the summary. Read the letter your mother wrote. When you're ready, there's a copy in there. I had Helen make one. Sleep on it. Sleep on it for a week if you need to. We can talk when you're ready. She nodded. She nodded a lot. She could not seem to stop nodding. Marcus had his arm around her now, holding her up a little. I walked them to the door. I helped her into her coat. I shook Marcus's hand, and this time he held my hand with both of his, and he did not say anything, but he did not have to. There are handshakes that say what a man cannot. They went down the porch steps and across the gravel to the Lexus. Rachel got into the passenger side. She did not look back at me. Marcus closed her door, gently, and went around to the driver's side. He looked at me over the roof of the car. He gave me a single nod. Then he got in. The Lexus started. The headlights came on. But it did not pull out. It sat there, on the gravel of my drive, with its lights on and its engine running. I could see Rachel in the passenger seat through the windshield. She was holding the craft envelope against her chest with both arms. Her head was bent over it. Her shoulders were moving the way shoulders move when a person is crying as hard as they have ever cried in their life. Marcus did not put the car in gear. He just sat with her. His hand was on the back of her neck again. I stood in the doorway of my house. The November cold was coming in around me. I had my hand on the doorframe. I watched my daughter cry in a car in my own driveway, holding a folder of paper that her mother and I had built for her. And I felt every one of my 62 years sit down on me at once. I did not go down the porch steps. I want to tell you why. Because I have been asked since. A man who reads this might think I should have gone down. He might think a father, in that moment, should have gone to the car and opened the door and held his daughter while she came apart. I did not go because I knew her. I have known her for 41 years. I have known her since she was the small weight of a swaddled baby in my arms in a hospital room in 1983. And I knew, watching her through the windshield of that Lexus, that what she was doing in that car was something she needed to do by herself, or with Marcus. Anyway, not with me. Not yet. If I had gone down to that car, I would have interrupted the work that Grace was doing in her in that moment. And Grace is shy work. You do not interrupt it. What I did instead was this. I reached over and I flipped the switch by the door for the porch light. The porch light came on, yellow, warm, the way porch lights look in November in southern Ohio when the leaves are all down and the wind is up and the sky has gone the color of old iron. I left the light on, and I closed the screen door, and I stepped back inside the house. I did not close the heavy door. I left it open behind the screen. I went to the kitchen window, and I stood there, and I watched. The Lexus sat in my drive for almost 20 minutes with the porch light shining on it. After about 10 of those minutes, I saw Rachel lift her head. I saw her look toward my porch through the windshield. I saw her see the light. I saw her face do something I have not seen on her face since she was a small girl coming up the walk to a father who'd been gone 3 weeks, that particular crack in the surface where you understand, suddenly, that you have been loved the whole time you were assuming you weren't. She put her hand on the dashboard. She held it there. Marcus said something to her I could not hear. She nodded. She wiped her face. She reached over and took his hand. A few minutes later, the Lexus put itself in gear and rolled slowly down my gravel drive and out onto the road. The taillights got smaller and smaller until the night took them. I stood at the kitchen window for a long while after they were gone. The porch light kept burning. I had decided somewhere along the way that I was going to leave that porch light on all night. Not because Rachel was coming back. She wasn't. She had a 3-hour drive in front of her, and 2 kids to get to school in the morning, and a marriage that was going to need a lot of repair in the weeks and months ahead. And that was the work she needed to be doing now, not the work of turning around in the dark. I left the light on because lights are how we say things we cannot say out loud. I left it on because I wanted her to know that the porch was lit, and the door was open behind the screen, and the man inside that house was her father. And that man was waiting not anxiously, not impatiently, but waiting for whenever she was ready to come back. I did not sleep much that night. I sat in the kitchen for a long time, with the dishes still on the table, and Margaret's pot roast gone cold in the casserole dish, and the candle in the little jar burned all the way down to its puddle. I thought about all the ways a life can move, and how very few of them are the ways you plan, and how most of the important ones are decided by people sitting at kitchen tables, talking about small things that turn out to have been big things. I thought about Margaret. I thought about Hannah. I thought about a 41-year-old woman in a Lexus on Interstate 70 with a Kraft envelope held against her chest. I thought about a 10-year-old boy in a race car bed in a blue bedroom, asleep right now, who in a few weeks would understand that he was not, after all, going to lose his house. I thought about a 13-year-old girl named Maddie, who would also one day understand. Maybe not soon. Maybe not for a long time. But one day. Maddie has her own road ahead. The trust account with her name on it would wait for her. The porch light burned all night. I checked it twice. Once at 1 in the morning, once at 4. Both times it was on. It is still on, in a way. Every night since. I have not turned that light off at sundown since the Sunday I am telling you about. I have left it burning every evening, and I have closed up the house behind a screen door, and every now and again since that night. I have stood at the kitchen window and looked at the warm yellow circle it throws on the porch boards, and I have thought to myself, that's for her. That's for them. That's the language we have now. That's the way we say it. That is most of the story. I want to tell you, before I go, about the weeks that have happened since. Not in great detail. The details are between Rachel and me, but I want to say a little. She called me the Wednesday after that Sunday. We talked for about 40 minutes. I cannot tell you everything she said. I will tell you that the first words out of her mouth, when I picked up, were Dad. I read Mom's letter, and then she could not talk for a while. And then we talked. She came down the following weekend. She came alone. That time. She sat at my kitchen table on a Saturday morning for about 3 hours. We went through the ledgers together. I showed her the column for May of 2006, with Margaret's 3-word notation at the top. For both girls, she put her hand on the page and held it there for a long time. She started coming down once a month after that, sometimes alone, sometimes with Eli. Once with Maddie, who is starting to thaw in the way 13-year-olds thaw, which is slowly and not all at once. Marcus has been quiet since that Sunday. I think his pride had a lot of work to do, and a man's pride only takes orders from a man's own self, not from other people. But he has been to the house twice since. The second time he stayed late, we talked, on the back porch, about things I had thought we would never talk about. He told me he was sorry, in his own way. I told him he didn't owe me anything. I told him to take care of my daughter. He said he would. I believe him, mostly. The mortgage payoff went through the Tuesday after that Sunday. Rachel called me from the closing. She did not say thank you. We had moved past thank you by then. She just said, "Dad, it's done. The house is theirs." She was crying, but the kind of crying that comes after the storm, when the sun is starting to come up over the wet land. I told her I was glad. I told her her mother would have been glad. We stayed on the phone in silence for a while. Then we hung up. The 2 trust accounts for Eli and Maddie are still untouched. They are still growing, slowly, the way Margaret wanted them to. They will be there when the kids need them. I still mail an envelope to Cincinnati on the 5th of every month. Doris still takes it across the counter without looking at the address. I have not stopped, and I do not plan to stop, because the habit was the point. And the habit is mine now in a way that even Margaret could not have foreseen. I sit on my porch most evenings, even now in the winter, with the brown jacket buttoned up and a blanket over my knees, and the porch light on behind me. I watch the road. I watch the maples. I watch the river when I can see it. The river still doesn't ask anything of me. I think a lot, these days, about what it means to be a father. I have decided, after 62 years on this earth, and 34 of them behind a wheel, that being a father is not what most people think it is. It is not the speeches you give. It is not the times you show up on the right day. It is not the trophy on the shelf or the diploma on the wall or the way your child introduces you at her wedding. Those are nice. Those are good. But they are not the thing. The thing is the quiet thing. The thing nobody sees. The 5th of November. The envelope on the counter. The decision, made at a kitchen table in a year your kids will never remember. To put aside something small for a day that may or may not come. Because if it comes, you want to be the kind of man who can stand up out of his chair and meet it. The thing is the porch light. The thing is leaving it on when she has not earned the right to expect it, and not turning it off when she finally drives away into the dark. The thing, in the end, is the love that doesn't have to be seen to be love. That's what your mother taught me, Rachel. That's what I have spent 30 years trying to deserve. I think I understand it now, in a way I did not understand it before. I think the understanding is the gift she left me. I think the gift is what I am giving back to you. That's most of what I have to say. I want to thank you, friend, for sitting with me through all this. I know it was a long story. I know some of it was hard. I hope, if there is somebody in your life you have been quiet with for too long, a son, a daughter, a brother, a father, that maybe tonight you sit down at your own kitchen table and write down a small thing you mean to do for them. And start, just start. The 5th of any month will do. Habits, not heroics. That was Margaret's lesson. It still is. If this story meant something to you, I would be grateful if you would share it with somebody who needs to hear it, and click the little button at the bottom of the screen that says you liked it, and stay with us for the next one. There is always a next one. Lives are made of next ones. And if you are a praying person, and even if you are not, I want to leave you with this. God has a way of putting the people we love into rooms where we will not see them clearly until we are old enough to deserve the sight. I do not know why He works that way. I have stopped asking, but I have come to believe that the love that has been there the whole time, even when nobody noticed, is the love that holds up the longest. It is the love of porch lights and quiet drawers and fifth-of-the-month envelopes. It is the love of people you didn't know were loving you. Until one Sunday night when somebody slides a craft envelope across a kitchen table and says, "Here, this was always yours." May you have somebody like that in your life. May you be somebody like that in somebody else's. Good night, friend. Take care of yourself out there. The porch light's on.